sell a book is not to produce a copy. To sleep on a book is not regulated anywhere in the world, because to sleep on a book is not to produce a copy. These unregulated uses of culture are then balanced by a set of importantly regulated uses. So to publish a book requires the permission of the copyright owner, because at least for some forms of creativity, that monopoly is necessary to create the incentives artists need to produce great new works. And then in the American tradition, there's a thin sliver of exceptions called fair uses. Uses which otherwise would have been regulated by the law because they produce a copy, but which the law says ought to remain free to encourage others to build upon or transform or criticize early or created work. Enter the net, where every single use produces a copy. The consequence of this new architecture is that this balance of regulated and unregulated and fair uses radically changes, merely because the platform through which we get access to our culture has changed. Read-write is thus presumptively illegal. So DJ Danger Mouse knew he could never get permission from the Beatles to remix their work. This kid, when he found he could wow Can for $218, then discovered it would cost over $400,000 to clear the rights to the music in the background of the video that he happened to shoot. AMV artists are increasingly getting notice and takedowns from lawyers representing artists who don't want their work celebrated in this particular way. And once again, my favorite example, I don't care what you think about Tony Blair, I don't care what you think about George Bush, I don't care what you think about the war, even though I do have a clear sense of what you might think about those three entities. The one thing you can't say about that video is what the lawyers said when they were asked for permission to synchronize that music with those images. The lawyers representing Lionel Richie said, no, you can't have our permission because, quote, it's not funny, end quote. Now, the point here is to recognize actually 3 points. Number one, no one in this place ever thought about this. There was never an ATM RICA Act, the act to massively regulate every creative act. This is the unintended consequence of the interaction between two architectures for regulation. Number two, the problem here is not copyright law. The solution is not to abolish copyright law. The problem here is a law which is simply out of sync with the technology. Copyright law needs to be updated to this technology. Before, we needed to regulate an extraordinary range of culture through the law to solve this problem of positive externality. The thing to recognize is that today we need to regulate less. And number three, what would those changes be? Well, there's a list, but here's the first. We need to give up our obsession with the copy. Copyright law is triggered upon the production of a copy. But a law that gets triggered upon the production of a copy in a digital age is, to use a technical legal term, just insane. We need to focus the law on meaningful activities, and copying is not a meaningful activity. Instead, we need to look at the context of use and ask, what is a meaningful thing to be regulating? So if you think about the difference between copying and remix, taking someone's music and sharing 10,000 copies with your best friends, or remaking the music versus the professional and the amateur, we have this, I'm sorry, I'm a professor, this matrix of options, right? So copyright law today says we regulate all of them the same. That's insane. Never before in the history of the law has it tried to regulate so broadly. It makes no sense to regulate that broadly now. Instead, the law, of course, needs to focus and give protection to professional artists to control the distribution of copies of their work. But amateurs must be absolutely free of regulation to engage in the remix of other people's work. Not fair use, but free use. Not your 12-year-old sitting next to your lawyer deciding how to balance the factors of fair use to know whether this Madonna song can be remixed with this Wilco song, but free use, the right to create and remix without worrying about what the law has to say. And then in between these two categories are more complicated cases that fair use needs more clearly to address. But the key thing to recognize about this map of change in the law is that it's a call for us to deregulate a significant space of culture and to clarify or focus the regulation where it can do some good. Now, instead of that sensible argument to deregulate here, instead of deregulating, what our Congress has done is launched us on yet another war, what many people in the industry call the copyright wars, but my friend, the late Jack Valenti, former head of the Motion Picture Association of America, used to refer to as his own, quote, terrorist war, end quote, where apparently the terrorists in this war are our children. Now, by speaking about it with this rhetoric of war, it leads us to think about what weapons we can develop to fight this war, weapons of law and technology designed to kill the enemy of piracy here, never seeing that the same weapons we use to kill piracy will also kill this read-write creativity. This is DDT to kill a gnat. Oblivious to the consequences, the environmental consequences of this regulation on this ecology of culture. Okay, so I said that there are two kinds of environmentalisms here. One calls for more regulation, one calls for less regulation. We need more regulation to deal with global warming, less regulation in the context of copyright. Is that, in fact, what we see our government doing? Do we see our government passing new laws to limit carbon and passing laws to deregulate culture? Obviously, no. Global warming and copyright have radically different strategies attached to them. No new regulation to deal with global warming. Lots of regulation to deal with copyright. 22 new laws to deal with copyright over the last 12 years. 0 laws to deal with global warming in the same period. Now, how can this be? One asks. Is it the theory of the harm in each case? Well, of course, it can't be an economic theory because maybe there's a harm from piracy. I'm willing to concede there's some harm, but whatever it is, it's tiny compared to the harm caused by global warming, yet we're dealing with piracy in 22 new laws and 0 laws to deal with global warming. Instead, the theory here, I think we need to recognize, is the theory of the green revolution. Not your green revolution, but this green revolution. The theory of a deep corruption that has built itself into our government. The economy of influence in Washington, corrupting the most basic institutions of our government to lead them to do nothing about the most important public policy problem we face, global warming, and to do the wrong thing about this, the most central part of the regulation of our culture. Now, I'm going to get back to that in a second, but before I get to that, I want to think about what we can do in both of these areas. There's a long road ahead in both environmentalism to deal with global warming and environmentalism to deal with culture. But we begin along that road by changing our own norms. We change the norms in order to lead to a change in law. So think about global warming. There's an important voluntary carbon neutrality movement, or I think it should be called another CC movement, which is a